Hey there, everybody, and well, where am I? There I am. And welcome to the Revolutionary People series of videos. There's only two, so I just thought history is more interesting with people. I don't think these should be too long, but famous last words from Mr. Gone. So these are the soon-to-be Americans. They are not Americans yet. They have to fight for that. But as we call them, right, the good guys. Happy to be biased. We talk a lot about bias and how bad it can be. But when it talks about the American Revolution, I'm fine with it. So first, I would write all their names and then obviously like what's highlighted. So first, we got George Washington. And there's a lot to be said about him, right? He is all over the place in American history, and we'll talk a little bit more about why that is, but this is just what he's doing in the American Revolution, okay? So for these biographies, I do actually expand beyond just what they did before the Revolution. This is about them in general. Even though we aren't quite there in history yet, it felt a little silly to talk about these people and then like just not mention why we talk about them and their successes during the Revolution. So he's head of the Continental Army. He's the top general. That is not without controversy. There are people who think that they should be the top general of the Continental Army. But that's his big contribution during the American Revolution. That is what he's doing. He had seen combat in the French and Indian War as a young man, right? He was running around when he was 20 years old and got cornered at Fort Necessity, if you remember that. But then he really redeemed himself in later campaigns, and even at Braddock's defeat, even though it was a defeat for the British, George Washington looks pretty good there. And then he's, spends the rest of the time marching around the Ohio River Valley and stuff. Shows up to the Second Continental Congress in his military uniform, basically saying, hey, pick me, guys. You won't go wrong. But his biggest contribution is actually a successful retreat. So a little bit, without getting too much into it, I'm sure I will in class, but basically when you are fighting something, a war like the Americans are fighting, a war of independence where your enemy, the British, does have democratic parts of their government, right? People in Britain are voting for politicians. Public opinion matters. The most valuable thing George Washington can do is just keep the American army alive. He actually doesn't need to win a ton of battles as long as his army survives, because Britain has to send armies from across the ocean, which is expensive, which means they raise taxes on their own people, right? That's part of what got us into this mess in the first place. So as long as his army, even if they just barely get away or whatever, as long as they're alive, that says to the people in Britain that their government is mismanaging the war or that it's not worth it, right? You can say, oh, we love being British and powerful and all this stuff and it's so great. Well, what if your brother has to go across the ocean to maybe die to, keep people from being free? So he's master of the successful retreat, which is a really big deal in history. When armies retreat, a lot of times that's when they fall apart and get destroyed. He never does that. He spends most of his war, he does show up at Boston first, but then he's going to have a big defeat, though he gets that retreat, big defeat in New York. He's going to have some wins in New Jersey. He's going to have some losses in Pennsylvania. So he's in that kind of middle colonies region, always around New York, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey. He is going to spend a big chunk of the war, really about 2 years almost, just outside of New York City, basically making sure the British Army can't leave it. He was obsessed with capturing New York City. It was a whole thing. But his biggest victory comes at Yorktown, where he basically is able to cut off a British army, which has gotten itself cornered in Virginia. But anyway, he will be our first president, but that's more of a later this semester story, and he does influence our lives a lot more that way. All right, Ben Franklin, interesting guy. one of our few, but not only, non-presidents to be on money. Ben Franklin is known as the founding grandfather because he was older than the rest of these guys. So he was actually already an old man during the American Revolution. He was interesting because he was actually already famous. So back in the day, if you were in Europe, you kind of considered the colonists to be like country bumpkins. You were basically like, yeah, there's 2 million colonists over there doing whatever. Who cares? And kind of thinking they're dumb or folksy might be a better word. But Benjamin Franklin was, scientific and political and a writer and all this stuff. And so in the early 1770s, he was spending a lot of time in London almost as like an ambassador to the British, being like, be nice for the colonists. There's one time he gets called in, I think it was after the Boston Tea Party. He gets called in and he gets dressed down because he wasn't necessarily for independence. He wanted what was best for the colonists. But he gets called in and he gets yelled at by British government officials, and he hates it. He sits there silently and like takes it, and so then he's like all on board. So he goes back. He basically helps draft the Declaration of Independence, gives Thomas Jefferson some notes and pointers, and then he will actually spend most of the war being ambassador to France. He sets up kind of a weapon running ring with the French, and he dazzles them, parties with them, and all sorts of stuff like that. But anyway, Sam Adams from Boston. He is one of the leading revolutionaries. He's on kind of the cutting edge. He's a radical. He is, again, not openly talking about independence because no one is, but talking about a lot more freedom for the colonists to make their own decision. Basically wants to be left alone entirely. So even though he's not like early on talking about independence or anything, he is always like, you can't tell me what to do. Leader of the Sons of Liberty, helps organize the Boston Tea Party. He will be in the Continental Congress, even though he's part of the delegation with his cousin John, who's going to be better at that part of things. John Hancock is another interesting one of those early Boston revolutionaries. He's like the protege of Sam Adams, which is just one of those things, which is a little weird just because he was, John Hancock was one of the richest merchants in Massachusetts, maybe the richest man in Massachusetts at the time, but politically he didn't know a ton yet, so he was learning from Sam Adams. Helped lead the resistance to the British in Boston. We talked about those writs of assistance and how the British could just search any ship anytime they wanted for any reason, basically by accusing people of being smugglers. John Hancock was one of the people who was always getting searched, and he hated that. Served in the Continental Congress, and he's famous because he signed his name big enough that the King of England could see it. Huge signature on the Declaration of Independence. John Adams, perhaps the grouchiest founding father. Mr. Gone, that's hilarious. Successful lawyer in Boston. He is famous for defending the British soldiers after the Boston Massacre. Now, he already was anti-having British soldiers in Boston. He didn't like that. But he believed in justice, and he believed in a fair trial for everybody, even awful soldiers you hate. So there's a lesson in there, right? He served in the Continental Congress and was really loud about, more rights for the colonies early on compared to other people in Congress, probably because he had seen firsthand British soldiers in Boston. He was like, we need to declare independence. Britain's done too much. He was one of the leading edges of that. Thomas Jefferson, and he will be the second president of the United States, which we'll talk about in class. Thomas Jefferson, another one we're going to talk about a lot in class. He's third president of the United States, but he's a Virginia guy. He's interesting in a lot of ways, good and bad. Went into debt because he had too many books that he bought, which is kind of funny. But anyway, he is from Virginia. He's a planter, slave owner. He supports independence, and he's not a great speaker, but he's a great writer, and everyone acknowledges that and has read his work and everything. And so when they write the Declaration of Independence, he is, if there's a trivia question, which one guy wrote the Declaration of Independence, it's him. Now, there's a lot more that goes into it because there's a 5-man committee, even though he was the lead author, and then it was edited by, like, the group. So 13 colonies and, like, 3 people. It was edited by, like, over 30 people. Just, marking stuff out that didn't fit, which is really, sounds awful. But anyway, John Dickinson, I include him. I always feel for John Dickinson. Early revolutionary supporting the rights of colonists. He wrote about it, letters from a Pennsylvania farmer, basically saying the colonists need to be treated better. I like to include him because he does not support full independence. He was, in the 1760s, on the cutting edge. This happens if you study different revolutions from all over. This always can happen, which is what's so interesting to me, that it always seems to happen, where someone who's on the cutting edge at the beginning ends up being called not revolutionary enough by the middle or the end of it. This happened with John Dickinson. He couldn't bring himself to vote for independence. They had a rule in there where basically if you couldn't bring yourself to vote for, if you didn't vote for independence, you weren't really welcome in Congress anymore, and because they wanted it to be like unanimous. It was like a weird thing. So he did drop out of Congress for that, and then weirdly, this was weird for me, went and joined the army. So he then went and fought, which most members of Congress can't say that they fought in the American Revolution. All right. We need to end the video. Have a great day.